in depopulated rural areas. This might sound like a topic that's been beat into the ground by so many other researchers, but the reality is that the research out there is lacking in a few areas, and we're going to be looking at why that is in a few minutes. Primarily, as implied by the picture you see here, we will be looking at ministry not from the perspective of ministers. Nor will we be looking at the work done by published theologians or even those who are considered or consider themselves to be experts in church dynamics. And to be honest, the majority of work being done on church growth and church dynamics is being done in either more urban charges, or the work that is available on the rural church is being done in the United States. So there's different societal and theological elements at play even there. So today, we will be looking at the question of successful ministry from the perspective of the congregants themselves. These are the people who grew up, live, and in many cases intend to die in the same church. These are the people whose voice, I think, has been, if not ignored, at least underappreciated. Something else that this image speaks to as we begin this journey is the growing or perhaps diminishing reality in our churches and our communities. Though less people are going to church these days, for our rural communities, less people are actually living in the communities themselves. Just to give you an idea of what's available out there for statistics, I brought this big book, which I could pass around later if you want, but it's pretty heavy. There's about 3 or 4 pages in here talking about the statistics of the United Church of Canada over the past 30 years, the decline in number and the decline in congregations. The reality is that as of 2009, 70% of the congregations in the United Church of Canada are rural. And more than half of the members of all the churches across Canada go to rural congregations. So this question is a very important one, not just for me, but for the wider church as well. So as we go forth, we'll be exploring how changes in societal structures have affected the way church is being done, and what congregants in these situations have to say about the current state and future state of their church. But before we get into what I discovered, we should understand why this topic was important not only to me, but to the wider church. The issues that affect rural congregations are close to my heart for a number of reasons. First among them is that I myself grew up in a rural congregation in PEI. This church was a formative part of my growth as a Christian. But even as I grew up in that church, I watched as a few people disappeared, never to return. And then a few turned to some, and some eventually turned to many. The church is still going today, but I can't help but thinking of that old cliche, it's nothing like it used to be. On top of all this, I watched as my Sunday school diminished as the years went by, and as we saw in Janice's presentation. Still, simply growing up in a rural congregation isn't the only thing that has kindled my interest. I also spent my internship on a rural charge in Saskatchewan. Despite the passion and faith of the people in the points on this charge, they were few in number. The evidence was on every main street in every small town. Shops had been closed and boarded up for years. People had moved away. So, a big part of their small numbers had to do with depopulation. However, in the face of this reality, these congregations didn't give up, and indeed were excited about being church in their area. This heightened my curiosity about the future of rural congregations across Canada. Finally, and perhaps one of the reasons that made my research most urgent, at least for me, is the fact that I feel personally called to rural ministry. So with the why I'm doing research in mind, let's take a look at the actual question itself. Maybe. There we go. At the core of my research was the question, how do congregations in depopulated rural areas experience and articulate successful ministry. It's a mouthful, I know, but what we're looking at here is actually something pretty specific. In fact, even asking this question as I have it here, it can be confusing and even misleading in some ways. Because when people hear the word successful, the first thing that many, including those who were part of my study, thought about was financial viability. But this study is not to research the financial viability of rural pastoral congregations. Yes, viability of a church is an important question, but it is an ultimately depressing one in a place where numbers are dictated by a declining population in the community. But even if someone gets past the issue of success being tied to finances, we still might stumble on the word ministry. Again, this is not a study of the success or failures of ministers. Granted, sometimes the ministry of a church is greatly affected by its minister. But that is not the case for all aspects of the life and work of a pastoral charge, especially when that work is driven by local volunteers. What the question is about is the ministry to which all churches, urban and rural, are called to by Christ, which is spreading the gospel. But in many rural areas, jobs are disappearing, and so are the people. So how do we spread the good news? What does the shape of that ministry look like? In other words, can a church in a depopulating rural area successfully live out that call from Christ? These are some pretty tough questions, and I think that the best people to offer possible answers and maybe even solutions are those people who have experienced the ups and downs of church for years. I approached this research using a qualitative study as many of the other students did. This allowed me to focus on a smaller group of participants, but go deeper with their experiences than I would be able to with a quantitative study. To get at that data, I used a grounded theory method. This ensured that whatever themes or theories came out of that research was derived from the experiences of those participants, the congregants themselves. I thought the best way to do this would be to get members from different congregations together and talk about what successful ministry might look like. So I found 3 rural pastoral charges here in the Maritimes. 1 from rural PEI, 1 from rural mainland Nova Scotia, and 1 from Cape Breton. Each pastoral charge had within it 3 points, so 3 churches. It is important to have 3 points because many of our rural congregations, or rural pastoral charges, have come together to share in the costs of ministry and other things. Another criteria for a charge to participate was that each point must have active members. This might sound like a very strange thing to say, but while I was on internship, I was actually serving a 4-point pastoral charge, but one of those points didn't have any active members. So they had to have active members in order to take part in the study. This enables me to have a 3-person interview with 1 member from each point on the charge. This kind of interviewing system allowed the participants not only to respond to the questions that I asked, but also to each other's answers. For example, different people walk away from a situation with different experiences. Where one had a positive experience, another might have a negative one. This played out in a very interesting way in my interviews. Now, the point of looking at different perspectives from the different pastoral charges offered a number of benefits. The first is that we were able to see what rural congregations, at least here in the Maritimes, might have in common with one another. Similar struggles, similar complaints, similar victories, and similar voices crying out to be heard. If we can get an understanding of how congregations function in a rural context in general, we can start to paint a picture of what that landscape might look like for ministers who are called to rural ministry. When we talk about similarities, one of the major ones that I came across in the course of my interviews was the importance of working with other denominations close by. Ecumenism. It was a big deal for most of my participants. Each pastoral charge in my study expressed the need to work together with their Anglican, Roman Catholic, and Baptist brothers and sisters. More on the similarities in a moment. Diversity also existed within our small corner of the country. What one congregation sees as a lived reality, another sees as a part of its past, or a potential for its future. Even how worship is carried out in these places is different depending on which charge we're talking to. So now the question comes, do the similarities in these situations outweigh the differences? Is there enough in common between these pastoral charges to say anything significant about them? More to the point, can what we find here be scaled and applied to other rural congregations in communities like in northern Ontario or southern Saskatchewan or other parts of the country? I would have to say yes, but with a small addendum to that. We have to recognize that there's no such thing as a cookie-cutter congregation. All these churches are different, but what we find here, we might be able to apply in some ways to other churches. After listening to the interviews and reading over the transcripts, there are some primary themes that I saw as common from one church to another. A clear frontrunner for these themes was the importance of community and how these communities support one another. Across all questions that I asked, people supporting one another and being not only in community, but in faith community was the most important thing to my participants. Within this, there is also a focus on building up leaders within the laity. This points to my second theme, which I was able to discern from the data, which is a sense of call or discipleship. Individuals expressed a call to offer their gifts, whether through leadership, in participation in the choir, or volunteering in some other way in the church. They had gifts they wanted to offer. But to connect to the previous theme, the participants also said that they were called to caring for these people within the community, both faith and secular. But despite a strong sense of community and a strong sense of discipleship, each focus group also expressed a concern that the relationship between the church and the community wasn't exactly reciprocal. In other words, participants felt that the church did more for the community than perhaps the community did for the church. This imbalance, whether real or perceived, leads to a concern for the future, a concern for legacy. They want to be there for their community, but with numbers falling both in the church and outside, the future of the church becomes uncertain. Still, amidst all the uncertainty that came with the future of these three communities, there was also a sincere sense of hope for that future. A hope that the work they do in community might continue, that the good news offered in these places might be offered for the foreseeable future and even beyond. I want to be clear, though. These are not the only themes that came up in the course of my data analysis, but they are the ones that my participants seem to come back to over and over and over again. Community, discipleship, concern, and hope. Let's look more closely at what the participants had to say about these themes and what they might say about successful ministries in these rural areas. As I said, community was the primary theme throughout the course of my interviews. And each group at one point or another used the same word to talk about their faith community: family. The people in these pews grew up together, went to school together, and have, for many, been a part of the same church community for years. As participant Lara put it, it's a very close-knit group, and I think people care very deeply. We're like a big family. Participants across the interviews offered similar statements, suggesting that the faith community was more than just a social group, more than just a collection of people who met once a week for an hour on Sundays. They are a family, People who see each other almost every day, who rely on one another for support, spiritual, moral, and otherwise. Still, despite growing up in a rural community myself and hearing words like support and fellowship, and yes, even family, I was curious about how each of these 3 pastoral charges understood being community, when each charge had within it 3 very unique and distinct congregations, each with their own past and building. I was surprised, and pleasantly so. Each pastoral charge expressed a level of connectedness between the points within the charge that I hadn't expected. Granted, that connection varies depending upon which of the 3 groups I was interviewing, but there was definitely a connection there. Rhonda uses these words: "We have different venues to have services, but it's the same big faith family." Doug even went one step further and said, "The church is really not just the building. The church is community. The church is people." In fact, when looking at how these communities care for one another, I also looked at how the congregants in each pastoral charge reacted to lay leaders for Sunday, those people who preached and led worship when the minister wasn't there. Within each group that I interviewed, there was at least one person who regularly did this. In every case, the lay leaders suggested that the numbers did not fluctuate as I might have expected. Lara said this: "When we preach, none of us are licensed, but we can go to church and there are still 40 people in the church." Now that doesn't sound like many, but in these rural congregations, that's the whole church. Everybody came out to support. Other participants within the group backed up these lay leaders by saying things like this: "Donna is preaching. We would say Donna needs the support so she knows that what she's doing is important." This was offered by Rhonda. So again, support in the community, in family, is a major part of the lives of these rural congregations. Now, these might sound like overly optimistic comments being made by the participants, but this only deals with how people felt about one another, and it doesn't really speak to the reality of how connected people are to their home church, the building itself. Still, this sense of connectedness across the points is one that makes it easier for joint work and services to be done for the benefit of the whole charge. And I think this points to a ministry that can be called successful. The next major theme that I want to focus on is a call to discipleship. This theme rose out of how participants felt that they and their church were called to spread the gospel in their communities. This has become an increasingly difficult job, since there are less and less people in these communities to spread the gospel to. And indeed, there are even more and more things to do on a Sunday morning than church, sleeping in seeming to be a popular one. So in light of this reality, people in these congregations have had to develop new ways to reach out to the community that wasn't confined to Sunday mornings. Adam says this about going beyond Sunday morning services: "We are about outreach, reaching out to people, reaching people." As an example of this, 2 of the 3 pastoral charges that I interviewed have regular fundraising community meals that take place either on days other than Sunday or on Sunday afternoons. This allows for a time of fellowship that people want, but they might not be able to get on a Sunday morning service. Along with a yearning to spread the gospel to new people, it is also the call of the church to care for the members that it has. Lara says, "We have sadly an aging population, but I think we care very well for that population." Yes, the future of the church is important, but so is the present. And no amount of new programming is going to bring in new people to the church when the only driving force behind that programming is to get people in. For myself, if I want to be a part of a project, I don't want to be a part of it because it's new and shiny. I want to be a part of it because the people that are doing it are excited about it. They want to be a part of it. So I think success is about spiritually feeding those you have, without the ulterior motive of drawing people in. More people is good. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. But when the goal is enriching the people that you have, it's a battle you're less likely to lose. You still may, but it's not as steep a hill. But no matter how much work we do to care for the spiritual well-being of those who are in church right now, we can't avoid the march of time. Bonnie puts a fine point on this reality by saying, we have no young people in our church. We are the young people, and we're not very young. This is a reality not only within the 3 rural pastoral charges I interviewed, but it is clear in rural and urban churches across the country. Along with comments like this was a feeling of abandonment on the part of the Canadian government. Now, this might sound like a very strange thing, but the reality is that for years, the government here in Canada has been pushing the Christian agenda, right? Even in our schools, there was prayer, so we were training young Christians, or the government was training young Christians. We don't have that anymore. So that work has been passed on to the rural and urban churches. And it's not easy work. And it's made more difficult when it's an uphill battle. Sometimes, no matter how successful a ministry of a church might be, our society pulls us back to financial viability. The 10 people in a church might all be active and lead a Wednesday lunch and have a Friday night Bible study, but it's not really sustainable financially for 10 people to keep a church going. Rhonda expresses this reality in these words: there's only a few people that go. It's eventually going to need too much work, and we're not going to be able to keep it up. These are hard realities that remind us that our attempts to redefine success in the rural context will always be tempered by the need to pay bills. And the common fix for the issue of high bills across multiple churches was one that caused some amount of tension amongst my groups. When I asked the question, what might have to change in the future for this particular charge? Nancy offered this: there's going to have to be changes that everybody might not be in agreement with in the beginning. But that doesn't really say what those changes are. So I probed her a little bit further and I said, what might those changes be? Well, Nancy was reluctant. She came back and said, I don't know if I wish to voice it. But it didn't take long for another participant in the group named Larry to pipe up saying, it starts with an A and ends with an N. Does anybody know what the elephant in the room was there? Amalgamation. Though it's a helpful move for some financially, it's not an easy process for anyone. Despite creating more financially viable future for the church, congregants are asked to give something up. And even though my participants expressed earlier how incidental a building is when it comes to worship, each participant also expressed a deep connection to their home church. They grew up there. They met friends there. They were with family there. These buildings are important to these people. And that's not a bad thing, but it makes the question of amalgamation one that people aren't eager to jump into. However, despite the concern for the future that most of my participants exhibited, they also expressed a sincere hope for that future. Don talks about overcoming problems as the church faces that future, and he says, we've had all these problems just for a variety of reasons of losing our clergy. And for a supposedly dying little church, we're not doing too bad. Now, I know this isn't the most enthusiastic thing you've ever heard about a rural church, but it's honest. And within that honest comment is hope that having overcome issues in the past, they might overcome issues in the future. Also, because of new initiatives like the suppers and the breakfasts for these communities, Adam points out, so you know, our pastoral charge, the name is out there, and they know what we're doing, or they have an idea of what we're doing. The church is a visible presence in the community, and people support it. They might not attend on Sunday, but at other times in the week they take part in the fellowship that the church community has to offer. Hope is a powerful thing, and the hope of these congregations have demonstrated reminds us that they are still here. It's been a rough road by times, but these people are not broken. They are not defeated. And though the future is uncertain, they are eager for worship. So where does this research leave us? Well, it provides us a lens through which to view rural pastoral charges, at least here in Atlantic Canada. It also reminds us that success is about more than whether a church is in the black or in the red. It's about building strong relationships in a community and understanding that the line between secular and religious in these places is blurred, if it's there at all. But what about those situations where there's an urban charge, 15 minutes or even an hour away? Why don't these people just go there and support the bigger church? The reality is rural ministry, rural congregations are still important, and they are still possibilities for success. Small rural congregations offer something that many urban churches struggle to offer: a sense of intimacy. Being able to know the person in the pew across the church from you because you have coffee with them almost every morning. Also, without rural congregations, we would lose an integral part of what makes the United Church the tapestry that it is. And the reality is that within that tapestry, all of our faith communities are facing a future with changes they might not recognize, but will be in themselves life-giving and faithful. But again, this research isn't about creating success. It's about redefining what we even mean when we say the word success. So as we come to a close, the final question that we have to ask ourselves about the future of rural ministry is, are we walking towards a sunset or a sunrise? I invite you to look at this picture. I shared it with the grads beforehand. Is this a sunset or a sunrise? I invite you to think about it for a moment. Like the future of our church, it's hard to know for sure what we're looking at. In fact, some of the graduates who I showed this picture to immediately jumped to it and said, "That's a sunset." But the problem is, we're used to seeing sunsets. We're rarely up for a sunrise. Similarly, we're used to seeing our rural churches close, and we miss new ways of understanding success in these places. When I look at this picture, I see a sunrise, the start of a new day, not just for rural churches, but for the United Church of Canada as a whole as we move forward together. Thank you. Now, questions? Oh no.
Hey. Oh no. Right off, great presentation, Ricky. But I'm just wondering, from your research, I'm wondering about pastoral implications. Say I'm a minister going out to a charge, quarter time, half time, full time. Just what are the pastoral implications of your research?
Something that I heard a lot of but didn't end up being a major theme in my research and data and through the interviews was that these congregants wanted their minister to be a part of their community as much as they were able to be, right? So if you're quarter time, be there 100% of that quarter time, right? It's about caring and loving the people that are there. Being out in rural Canada can sometimes feel like you're alone. So if you've got a minister, however long they're there caring for you, that's important. So I think that's a pastoral implication. Woot. Awesome. No questions to answer. I didn't know I got good research, I guess. Or bad, I don't know.
I can't let you off the hook, Ricky. I always flag the word family when I hear a presentation like this one, and it's a word that folks in a church of any size, but particularly in the small rural church, really like. And just to set up my question, one of the problems with the image of family is that it is the social structure that is most difficult to get into.
Yeah.
You enter a family, you either have to be born into it, or marry or be adopted into it, but that is by the consent of members of the family.
Sure. Yeah.
So I ask two things. Given the nature of so many rural communities, where very often all that are left are 3 or 4 extended families, and they make up the congregation as well.
Sure.
What sense did you get that these folks were using that word family kind of interchangeably between their church and their biological family? And secondly, did they talk about how people find their way into the congregation if they come to visit? Was there anything that might make it difficult for someone who did come into the community to make their way into these congregations, being that they are so strong and self-defined?
Well, you make a really good point. And what you're saying about rural churches is actually a reality in small rural communities. I mean, try and move into a rural community and not be stared at, right? The reality is that for the most part, when they use the word family, they used it in terms of mutual support as opposed to what you mentioned there of this family that you're born into and a part of. They didn't speak to it in that way, but they did speak to it as support. So how hard is it going to be for new people, supposing there is a new person, to get into that kind of church? From what I was able to understand from the interviews, and again, I only interviewed 9 people across 3 congregations, there's definitely an openness to accepting new people because they want new people there as much as possible. But the reality is, in these rural communities, you're a CFA, even if you're there for decades. You come from away, right? I think within the faith context, from what I've been able to experience over the course of the interviews and over the course of my own life, people are excited to welcome people into their home. And by home, I mean their actual home and their faith home. And to make them a part of that family in whatever way they can. And it's not about giving them a job, handing out bulletins at the door. It's about saying, this is me, who are you? And let's get to know each other. So yeah, there's definite barriers in rural congregations about getting over that. You're not from here, but there's also that loving care that I think rural congregations, rural communities across Canada, and I was able to experience a couple, are ready and willing to offer. To bring people in and make them a part of that family, however they can. Yeah.
This may be a really naive question. I'm wondering, do you know in the communities that you were working with, were there other denominations represented? I mean, where my mind is going is, I don't know if would there be resistance about interdenominational kind of things, so that this people experiencing the same struggling thing in their corner can somehow have a shared experience, while it's not strictly United Church or strictly Anglican Church, that there is some kind of an opportunity there for worship of some kind?
For sure, and I mentioned it again only in passing, the importance of ecumenism for these people in these places in rural Canada. in one of my interview sites, there was actually mixed denominations with worship. They shared worship with another denomination. It's another way to save money and to create a space of ecumenical worship. So there's that. In another of my interview sites, a question that comes up that came up was, how do you react with this being such a Roman Catholic area? Well, we're all best friends and we get along really well, and so we all share this lived reality of declining numbers. So rather than shut the doors and hide the sheep, they intermingle amongst one another, and I think that's a real gift that the rural church is living out, is this shared space for worship and shared time for worship with one another. So, Rob in the back.
Thanks, Rick.
Yeah.
So what I observed living and working in rural areas is that a lot of folks in churches are really concerned about survival.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to be the watchword.
Yep.
And I wonder how we can encourage folks to tap into a deeper memory of mission.
Yeah.
Because survival is kind of the objective of, like, wood ticks, So how is it that, or another way to ask it is, why does God need or desire thriving rural churches?
That's a really good question.
Rather than saying, gosh, let's make a goal of existing. So how can we reframe the question in terms of missiology?
Sure, one of my questions was actually, where do you feel that God is calling this congregation, or do you feel God is calling this congregation to exist at all? And of course, the answer was yes, this congregation should exist. But an overwhelming reality is that when we get close to losing resources, we ration, we go to survival mode. So getting past that, success as financial viability, was the first barrier I came up against in my interviews. Getting past that and talking about what successful ministry looked like was actually harder than I had thought it would be, but that made it life-giving, right? Because then they started to open up about these things that they were doing, like caring for the aging in the community. That sometimes maybe it's not about getting all these youth in the door. Sometimes maybe it's about caring for all these retirees that are moving to the area. Sometimes it's about changing the message that we've been beating ourselves over the head with for the last 30 years. It's about redefining what success looks like. And that, I think, is how we live out that mission that Christ calls us to, right? Is to offer that message, that gospel, in a new way, but in a way that reaches and touches people, whether it draws more people in or not. I don't know that for me, that's less of an issue. For treasurers, it is. So.
Thanks, Ricky. Really enjoyed that.
Thanks, Mo.
Great. You're going to do well out there. From my limited experience with small, rural, multi-point churches, some of the most meaningful experiences we had took place in somebody's home.
Oh, yeah.
Where we had the service and we had a shared meal.
Yep.
They were some of the highlights. So my question or point is, was there ever any discussion about the reconsidering the use of these old buildings which consume so much time, energy, and money to think of church in a new way?
Yeah. It did come up at some points throughout the interviews. The conversation around having church in someone's home wasn't as prevalent as it might have been out on my internship charge, where we actually did that from time to time. The reality is we talk about these struggling rural pastoral churches. Some of them still have between 40 and 100 people. And I mean, that's across three points. So it's harder to get 40 people into a person's bungalow. Not impossible, but it might not be comfortable. But you're right. I think it's about discovering new ways to like I mentioned, to be church. Sometimes it's not about the Sunday service on Sunday, or the Sunday morning service, and sometimes it's not about being in the church. One of my interviewing sites actually has one service a Sunday that they rotate between the churches, and how the minister did this in the past was he said, okay, we're not going to go to any church, we're going to rent out a space in the hall. It's nobody's space, it's neutral, we're going to worship there together, and once we're used to each other, then we'll start to go and visit each other's home, like church. So I mean, yeah, I think home services is one step, but I think there's a whole slew of other options out there as well to feed the needs of bigger groups, though they are small.
Thank you, Ricky. Family and mission. Just a quick one, Refamily. Yeah, this is something that was said to us in the rural context where we spend most of our time. Yeah, we're a big family. We don't all get along.
Definition of a family.
Especially yeah, that's right. So, you know, I think the question of even within the dynamics of a self-identified church family, you know, what is the ministry of reconciliation, right? Yeah. But what I really wanted to focus on was the question of mission. You know, what are we here for? And I guess this goes back to what Rob was talking about. Are we here just to have a place to come as long as we're alive? Or, you know, does God visit here anymore?
Yeah.
As in this part of the world, does God actually live here anymore, right? So what is the link? And I guess this is a question, you know, did anyone talk about the link between the decline and depopulation of the churches as part of something that is a question that everyone in the region is living with, you know? The decline and depopulation of the regions, and might mission be explored relative to a desire for life, or God's desire for life in the region, whatever that might look like.
So, and just to clarify, we're talking about how do we do mission in a place where people are moving away?
No, sort of. I'd say, yeah, I'm sorry if that's not entirely clear. What does God call the church to within a context of decline and depopulation, beyond a concern for ourselves?
Right, more than just maintenance or keeping the doors open until we die and have the funeral
and
there.
taking care of people while they die, like more than palliative care, right?
Yeah, and I think, and it came up on the slide. It's being that voice in the wilderness, and it's you know, recognizing the hurt and pain out in these places where jobs are disappearing, right? So what is God calling these congregations to live out in those places? I don't think it's about keeping doors open till the funerals are all over. And from what I understood from the interviews, that was a part of it, but it wasn't the main part. It was about being the body of Christ where they were, right? And living out that call. And recognizing that, yes, people are moving away, that the landscape is changing. But that the call to be church is still there, and maybe that doesn't answer your question at all.
I guess you know, there's a habit in rural Nova Scotia. Now I'm getting onto dangerous territory.
God's country,
I'll give away the microphone. Of feeling passive before what's coming, and of course we live in contexts that are bigger than us. We don't control all the forces. But the question of agency, right? You know, if we feel we have a mission, if we discern a mission, if we ask what is God calling us to,
Yeah.
we're not simply there to deal with what's happening.
No,
But-
yeah, and I think that it's about more than this is the way things are, right? And becoming numb to that reality. But you're right. There's confusion about what the future of the church looks like and what that mission looks like. What it was in the past is not what it is now, nor what it will be in the future. So these are answers that I can't give you because nobody knows the answers to those questions right yet, because we're not there yet. But the hope is that it's not that we just stay open, but that we stay open, that the word of God might come from these places and to offer something significant and real. That's just what I heard anyway.
Rick, we do need to stop. We've gone again. Interesting thing, we've had 7 presentations so far. They're all at about 30 minutes of presentation time and 15 minutes of questions. And throughout, we've exceeded the 15-minute question period for all 7, which speaks to the fact that I think each of the students so far, and I think you'll see that trend continue, have picked up themes that have somehow captured the imagination of a lot of people. And today, certainly, you go into a situation and you, as a researcher, unearth new insights, and you suspend your beliefs and your assumptions, and that's one of the most critical dimensions of being a good researcher. You're not here to proof, no one has been here to proof text their ideas. What they've been here to do is to discover new realities, and with Rick today, you heard new realities of vital congregations that identify and self-identify, and in the last part of our questioning, we came to a point of saying, can we identify more strongly with messiology? We've got a vibrant force in rural Nova Scotia, rural Prince Edward Island, rural Cape Breton. How can we animate that to be even more aggressive, more progressive in maintaining, as we started with square one, an evangelical, an open, an evangelical mission to change our world? Rick, you took us through a lovely presentation to begin our lively afternoon. Rick Bowley, well done.
Thank you.